serves as the executive director of the Royal Canadian Air Force Association, where he oversees the organization's operations and manages its quarterly magazine. Additionally, he serves as the secretary to the RCAF Association Trust Fund Board of Trustees. Dean's dedication to excellence extends beyond RCAF Association. He's also the certification director for the International Association for Strategy Professionals, where he plays a crucial role in developing and maintaining professional standards for strategic planning and management. Before embarking on this career path, Dean served with distinction in the Canadian Armed Forces for 30 years as a tactical helicopter pilot. He amassed over 3,000 flying hours and participated in 5 operational tours, including a mission with the United Nations. Dean's academic achievements are equally impressive. He holds a BSc in Applied Science and an MA in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada. Also, an MA in Leading Innovation and Change from St. University Robert Kennedy College. He's also currently pursuing a doctorate in business administration. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Dean is actively involved in various organizations and committees. He's a member of the Knights of Columbus, the Institute of Corporate Directors, and the Royal Canadian Legion, and among others. He serves on the board of directors of Professional Association of Volunteer Leaders. Dean is also a published author with articles appearing in leading journals and book chapters. His writing spans various topics, including strategic management, association management, innovation, and military history. In short, Dean is a highly accomplished individual with a diverse range of skills and experience. His dedication to service, leadership, and lifelong learning makes him a true asset to any organization. Please join me in giving Dean a very warm welcome. A very warm welcome, Dean Black. A very warm welcome, and you are over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Srichitika. I am really honored to be here to join such an esteemed audience. I assume that I have the benefit of academics and professionals and others with a serious interest in business management and all of the subject areas that come with that particular area. And I like to emphasize that there is a lot going on when one is into business management. And that point came home to me when I was taking the MA in Leading Innovation and Change with the York St. John University and Robert Kennedy College. This presentation title indicates that it touches on organizational culture, innovation, and governance. But I know lots of folks who are signing in, checking in with us today will understand there's a lot more going on, including economics and politics and change management and risk management that come up in these important discussions about how to get on in today's world. The elements of the title are worth spending a few minutes talking about so that members of our audience have a sense where I might be able to take this particular presentation. There are 4 words there: leadership, culture, innovation, and governance. The first word, leadership, is rather complex. I know everybody appreciates that fact. And there are so many different approaches to leadership that it can be confusing. After many years of study and experiences in military organizations and in the nonprofit sector, I've come to appreciate that those who view leadership in a sort of binary fashion, either transactional or transformational, are really on something. all of the other definitions of leadership in terms of the approaches leaders take, followers take, those are all embellishments of the idea that in terms of leadership, it's either transactional or transformational, one or the other. And if you would like to approach the definition of leadership in that way, it will probably prove very, very helpful. And I'll see how far I can take that idea with the presentation today. Culture, the second term, refers to organizational culture. And I think we understand that as the set of values, beliefs, attitudes, the systems, and the rules that outline and influence employee behavior within an organization, or in my case, member behavior within the nonprofit organizations that I lead. The culture reflects how these employees or customers or members and vendors and stakeholders experience the organization. Words right there, stakeholders and brand. Hopefully, I'll be able to expand on both of those so that we have a good understanding of those domains or attributes, if you will, of organizations. All organizations have stakeholders. Many organizations ignore that fact or just group all of the people who are vested in the outcomes of the organization into one group of stakeholders without defining them in more detail. And the brand is a bit of a nebulous word, but it covers a lot of things. And in my current thesis effort for the UniAthena DBA, I'm looking at fiduciary responsibilities through certain processes. And in my interviews, I'm having trouble making clear to the folks who are responding that fiduciary means, in part, protecting the organization's brand. It's when I try to get around to defining what brand is that I run into some challenges, which is all great fun. Innovation, we understand it's either something new that you're wanting to deploy, or you're considering deploying, or it's something old for which you've determined a new use. Governance, finally, in this particular title, includes oversight, but it is indeed a broader concept. It refers to the structures and the systems and practices an organization has in place to assign the decision-making authorities, define how decisions are to be made, and establish the organization's strategic direction. There are other elements to governance, but I think that suffices to give an idea of what I'll be trying to talk about through this particular presentation. Let's see if I can change the slide. Right. This particular photograph of my wife and our 4 granddaughters, I thought was really nice because these little cuties are a lot of fun, but it's also kind of fun because of the expressions on their tiny little faces. And these expressions tend to define me in my effort to understand the nonprofit world after 30 years in the military. I hope you can see some humor in this analogy as I explain what their little expressions seem to indicate to me. And of course, this is an extension of the last module in the DBA program with UniAthena, and that was a reflexive model. You know, it encouraged us to think about who we are, what we believe, what our values are, and how important we see the DBA program, or even becoming a researcher, and how to go about conducting the business of a researcher. As I indicated early in the title, I think the title was actually, yeah, there's one slide missing, but it is the title I had used was I'm seeking a life jacket, an academic life jacket, to help me understand this new career that I set upon back in 2006, 2007, after retiring from the military after 30 years. And to say that I'm still a little bit curious and troubled and challenged is an understatement, of course. So again, the expressions on the faces of these little girls sort of captures all of my moods and moments in my journey trying to figure out this new career. In the bottom left corner, little Sophia, she'll be 5 years old next year. And you can sense that she's happy, but she's shy. And it's a perfect example of how I feel still to this day. I'm growing more and more comfortable with all of the dimensions of the nonprofit sector beyond the dimensions of the military or government sector that I worked in for 3 decades. But at the same time, I'm shy because there are areas that I still haven't figured out. Organizational culture is diabolical sometimes. It is really hard to gain a grip on it because there's always something surprising not predicted around the corner. Little Sophia is holding hands with her cousin Madeline, who is 2 now. And Madeline, of course, is so innocent and happy, cute little smile, like I felt when I first made the transition without knowing what I was getting into. And finally, the twins. My wife is holding on to Evelyn, and I'm holding on to Lillian. These are fraternal twins, not identical. They're 18 months now and on the verge of walking. Little Evelyn seems content and happy, comfortable, warm, no fears and no curiosities. She's just ready for anything that comes her way. But I took notice of Lillian from the moment she was born because her expression always seems to be troubled. She's a good little baby, and she is happy for the most part, but her expression is always one of greater study, more concern, a little bit worried. She may not have faith in everything that comes her way because she doesn't understand it. I think that's a good journey through all of my emotions and sensations and feelings as I struggle to learn all about human behavior and organizational behavior and all of the other dimensions that I've alluded to this point. So I hope I can share some of these episodes with those in the audience so that they can appreciate some of the ideas. So innovation. I've always been very, very curious about innovation. I defined it as deploying something new or deploying something old that you've determined a new use for. But of course, it's a lot more than that. There are leadership issues and organizational culture issues to overcome to convince people that it's a good idea to make the change. And we know how challenging innovation can be from the likes of Machiavelli and many others like us who do the research to come to a better understanding how to succeed more often with new innovations. Let's see here. The project that really got me going came on the aerospace systems engineering course back in 1990, 1991. And at the time, many of us, my age anyway, would have been watching carefully as the Allied world, led by the United States and the United Kingdom, had decided it was the right thing to do to protect Kuwait and Saudi Arabia by informing Saddam Hussein of Iraq that it was not right for him to take over Kuwait. And of course, That conflict involved a great number of fighter aircraft, second and third generation, like the one on the left. Today, we are aware of fifth generation aircraft whose cockpits look remarkably different from the second and third generations, like the one on the left. Here you have two different technologies, or levels of technology, if you will, clearly indicating significant innovation over decades. And what a remarkable struggle it would have been for all of the people all around the world who did their best to find a better way to make flying operations more effective, more efficient, safer for the men and women who take up the profession. And this is, I guess, one of the best examples of why innovation I find so fascinating. Innovations come in two forms, the incremental form and the radical form. Incrementalism is our nature. Human beings do not like change, especially radical change. We may be able to tolerate incremental change, small bits of change now and then, if someone, the leader, is successful convincing us why it is important to adopt that change. Why, for example, it is important to replace the analog gauges and meters in a cockpit with the digital view screens that you now see in fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft. Radical innovations are sometimes necessary, especially when we get into crises. And I think all of us could probably point to an example of a crisis in their country or company or family that required change of a radical nature, changing course, changing trajectory, to implement some sort of new process, product, what have you, to make life better tomorrow. This is what I've been keenly interested in, the genealogy or lineage and trajectory of these things. So there you have a sense of the presentation as I've built it through the slides that I will share. The introduction, the nature of the present challenge, the benefits of the DBA, as I've alluded to some of them already, exploring my fascination with innovation and what makes it difficult. I'd like to talk about the status of a PhD that I started in 2004 and how I ended up where I am today, because there are really good lessons in that PhD work that I'm going to try and bring into the DBA thesis preparations I'm now doing. And I'll conclude with returning to the present challenge and talk about stakeholders, stoperators, and strategy. I alluded to the reality many organizations may pay lip service only to stakeholders. And in one case from an interview just yesterday, I learned some organizations don't actually define stakeholders with enough detail or resolution, choosing instead to group them all together as opposed to separating them out for who they are. Stoperator was a great term I learned last week when I was asked to do a presentation on innovation to the Special Operations Aviation Squadron here in Canada. They had a leadership program they do once a week, and I went there to talk about innovation, and one of the organizers heard me describe the challenges that you can face dealing with folks who are reluctant to change. And he said, yeah, those are the folks we call stoperators. And I thought that was a marvelous term because it does tend to capture this idea of what I refer to as gate guardians. Folks are so resistant to change, they'll do everything in their power to make sure it doesn't happen. That's what I'm facing in one of the organizations I work for today. And it's sad because it's on the verge of dissolution, which will probably come to pass by the end of the next calendar year. And finally, strategy. I alluded to the fact that what we're talking about is rather complex, involves leadership, innovation, change management, project management, risk management, organizational culture and behavior and development and learning. Strategy is the same. It takes on all of those aspects and attributes and adds to it economics, politics, and all kinds of other disciplines and domains that we need to be familiar with, at least familiar with as leaders, especially. The problem in this organization I work for, one of the organizations I work for that is close to dissolving, I've come to discover that the governance system that extends to me the privileges of authority is broken. And it's broken because while my duties and responsibilities are clear under the guise of stewardship theory, meaning that all of the duties and responsibilities have been entrusted to me, it doesn't come with the endorsement that that sort of entrustment would seem to indicate or demand or expect. And that has something to do with human behavior from the non-executive leaders who are members of the board of directors. Again, it's the structure of the organization that empowers half of them, not with actual authorities, but with administrative responsibilities that are regional in nature, even though the organization has no geographical or regional imperatives. These individuals have taken on their administrative responsibilities in their regions and assumed authority and power where they don't have any. And this, I think, is the mechanism that denies me the endorsement I need, and that would be of benefit when I try to do my job supporting the members of the association. I'll touch on this idea later as we explore the trajectory of this particular job and responsibility. So in terms of stewardship theory, theorists assume that given a choice between self-serving behavior and pro-organizational behavior, a steward, or me, will place higher value on cooperation than defection. Stewards are assumed to be collectivist, pro-organizational, and trustworthy. But a governance regime covers all the ways and means used to produce collective action, bringing together different stakeholders in a problem via a process of alignment. Action is an important word here. If there's only one person, the steward or me, taking action, but I'm not endorsed for the actions I take, then all the members who are meant to benefit from these actions are going to be suspicious, especially when the folks on the board of directors who have assumed regional authorities and powers that they don't have muddy the issue and make it confusing for the members everywhere. That essentially explains the challenge that I'm facing in this nonprofit organization. Entrustment without endorsement. I think it might be worth explaining a little bit about the organization so that folks in our audience understand what I'm trying to work with. It's a simple or common interest nonprofit organization that's funded by individual members. So all of the work that I'm asked to do that's been delegated to me by a policy forming board of directors as opposed to a managing board of directors. All of that work is meant to provide programs, products, and services in support of the individual members. The structural problem arises as a consequence of the association's decision to invite individual members in numbers of 25 or more to form a chapter or a branch in their community. And where one chapter or branch forms, you then have a requirement for, an administrative requirement for a regional governing body to provide assistance. And these are called groups. Remembering this is the Air Force Association, we call our chapters or branches wings, and the groups are above the wings, and the entire organization and board of directors is above the groups. And the 6 groups are led by individuals who also serve on the board of directors of the organization as a whole. I'm sure you can now see all kinds of structural challenges and the human natures that come with leadership and important positions have created what I referred to earlier as stop-raters. I'll have more to say about what exactly the Air Force Association does towards the end of the presentation, as I capture some of the main points that I'm hoping I can share with you today. Now, innovations are basically the changes that a leader would like to introduce. Changes come in the form of a new product or a new program or service, or they come in the form of an old product, program, or service for which a new use has been determined. Innovations are not easy to introduce in organizations. They are quite difficult. And that's because of stop-raters. And stop-raters make things difficult for leaders. And stop-raters are representatives of elements of the organizational culture that is resisting the change. Why? Because elements of the organization's culture believe differently, have a different set of values and attitudes, and prefer to use different governance systems to get their work done. In terms of governance systems, I'm hoping I can touch on the phenomenon of informal governance systems as opposed to formal governance systems. Formal governance systems are the board of directors, the appointment of group presidents, and leaders at the wing level, if you will. Those are the formal elements. The informal elements are the non-elected board of advisors that you find in some organizations. And it's especially true in this particular organization. And it's unfortunate because the folks who are elected tend to defer to the informal, non-elected folks for their thoughts. And those thoughts tend to lead to bias informed by previous generations and conditions that are no longer relevant. And yet, it's because people attribute identity to the roles that they played long ago. And when you try to introduce innovations that have an impact on that identity, on those roles, on those long lost ideas that are no longer relevant, then you end up in trouble. The tactics of innovation is a system developed by James Bright, an MIT and Harvard professor from the mid-1960s. And I prefer this particular system because the PhD thesis I pursued beginning in 2004 was about technology that was first introduced during and after the Second World War, but really started to take hold in the mid-1950s and 1960s. And that's, of course, helicopters, what I spent 30 years flying, but I'll get to that very soon. The tactics of innovation I spoke about, the 10 rules for introducing innovations, I'll be listing in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about Mr. Bergerson, who's a political science professor specializing in bureaucratic politics, international and homeland security policy, and civil military relations. I did get a chance to speak to him a number of times about his book, The Army Gets an Air Force. He passed away in 2019. He was a veteran of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile during the Vietnam War. The United States waged from about 1952 to 1975. The thesis presented by Professor Bergerson was focused on the tactics of insurgent bureaucratic politics. And this fascinated me to no end, to learn that within a government system, it was people who were breaking the rules that actually won the day. They found workarounds, runarounds, to put a lid on the stoperators, if you will, the folks who were so reluctant to allow change to be introduced, that they were seen as a danger to the organization's success and future. So individuals within the government, within the U.S. Army, took it upon themselves to break the rules and find workarounds that Bergerson labeled insurgent bureaucratic politics. And it's a fascinating story. It was for me, and it encouraged me to analyze similar processes in Canada and the UK, because the UK, Canada, and the United States all went through the implementation of the helicopter innovation at the same time. It's important to emphasize the tactics of innovation I'll be talking about have nothing to do with you as the innovator. It doesn't matter what you believe or value. It's important that you understand what you value and what you believe and what your attitudes are, but you always have to consider these tactics in relation to the user. It's the user's perspective, never the innovators. That's more important. Also, innovation is driven by ambition, fear, and insecurity. Costs are relatively clear from the outset, but of course, benefits not so much. It's the fact that a lot of people being subjected to the implementation of an innovation cannot see the benefits for any host of reasons, including personal and otherwise, makes innovations especially challenging. Again, we know this from the work of Machiavelli and others who have come to a good understanding of the challenges of innovation. Speaking of Machiavelli, he is the one who explained the innovator has enemies in all those who are doing well under the old order. Those are the stoperators. And he only has lukewarm defenders in all those who would do well under the new order. Those are real challenges for anybody hoping to put an innovation onto the street. Humans are keenly aware of the loss, while only vaguely aware of the gain. So James Bright considered the work of Machiavelli and Schumpeter. Schumpeter may be familiar to many of the folks with us today. He is the man who coined the term creative destruction, and is considered one of the foremost experts on innovation even today. I believe he was a Austrian by origin, and again, he coined the term creative destruction, meaning that new thing or that new process or that new program, that new product, or that new way of deploying that old product, program, and service, when it is implemented and it's successful, it effectively destroys the old that it replaces. And the whole process of innovation is a creative one, but it's also a destructive one. And that I think it helps to explain what Schumpeter was getting at. And Christensen, as another famous expert on innovation, also emphasized this idea of creative destruction. So here we are, and we're in a nonprofit organization, the third sector, or we're in a private organization like a business, or we're in a government organization. And we are faced with the requirement for an innovation. And these 10 ideas are meant to help you deploy your innovation. And if you can bring to bear aspects of one or more of these tactics, you are likely to be more successful than otherwise. And you don't require all 10, but of course, the more the merrier. And there are two that are absolutely mandatory. The first one, the perceived advantage, and the last one, understanding the consequences of failure. Those two are mandatory for success. They're the only mandatory ones. If you can convey the idea, the purpose, the utility, the methods of employing the new product, program, or service, or the new way in an old product, program, or service, then you are likely to succeed. And if you can also do so in a manner that makes it clear what the consequences of failure are, then you are likely to succeed. But that's a good starting point. Perceived advantage and failure consequences, remember, from the view of the user, if you will. The other 8, from compatibility, perceived simplicity, divisibility, communicability, reversibility, relative costliness, credibility, and reliability, those are not mandatory, but the more that you can convey with your innovation, the more likely you are to succeed. And before I move on to the next slide, I'll share the best example that James Bright and others who like to use Bright's system tend to share to demonstrate what we mean by tactics of innovation is Thomas Edison and the electric light bulb, replacing the gas light bulb system. The consequences of failure, of course, so the story goes, was when you turn the switch, it doesn't go boom. And the analogy of electric light bulb and gas system that Thomas Edison brought to the world tends to fit all 10 tactics. I'll just leave that idea with you as you ponder and contemplate these ideas. So again, my interest arose from a fascination with the helicopter, but not just the helicopter. I was also interested in the development of organic air forces seeking to leverage the helicopter as their primary platform. And by this, I mean the Canadian Army, for example. In the period right after the Second World War, the world was accustomed to a separate army, a separate navy, and in most cases, a separate air force. But air power was evolving very, very quickly. I mean, it was 1903 when the Wright brothers flew, and in less than 15 years, air power was a significant component of combat in the First World War. And in less than 6 decades, we were landing men on the moon, or about 6.5 decades, we were landing men on the moon. And just after the Second World War in 1945, along comes the helicopter, something so radically different from fixed wing aircraft, including bombers and fighters and passenger aircraft, that just looking at how armies and air forces and countries attempted to deploy this new innovation is, again, I found very, very fascinating. The timelines I've shared, the types of helicopters, there are, in the case of military helicopters, there are 4. And I'm hoping that this short presentation will help folks see why some organizations succeeded in deploying the helicopter innovation and others did not. This is the helicopter I flew operationally for the better part of 20 years on 4 operational tours. It's the CH-136 Kiowa. The Americans called it the OH-58 light observation helicopter. And this is a photograph of me in Norway. I transitioned to the twin Huey helicopter, a twin engine helicopter that was a utility tactical transport variant and could take a team of 15 soldiers in addition to the crew of 3. And this particular helicopter is painted for United Nations operations. And finally, you'll notice this helicopter has 2 main rotor blades, while this one has 4. This is the Bell 412, or what we call the CH-146, a more powerful, a more modern version of the previous helicopter, if you will, with an upgraded avionics system, more powerful engine, and different systems altogether. We bought these in 1996, and they continue to fly today. The reason I shared these 3 elements is to show you one type of helicopter is the observation helicopter. The second helicopter is utility tactical transport helicopter. And the third is the medium lift helicopter. I think I have an image of that later in the presentation. Suffice to say that the Chinook and the Puma and others are from this genre. They can carry up to 35 troops with a crew of 4. In some cases, they've been used to jump in and rescue folks in need of movement, and 100 people have been fit into the back of a Chinook helicopter. And finally, armed or attack helicopters. That's the 4th variant. The organizations that have been successful, most successful, are those that were capable of deploying all 4 variants in their particular Air Force. Canada was not successful because it was only focused on 2. And the other part or challenge was that it was an Army organization that was trying to stand up its own Air Force, in other words, organic to the Canadian Army. But the folks in the Air Force, back in the day, in the mid-1960s, they turned out to be stop-operators of the Air Force kind. And they managed to put an end to the Canadian Army's effort in one form or another, where today you have these Army helicopters are owned by the Canadian Air Force and flown by the Canadian Air Force, which was quite different from the beginnings of the Canadian Army's Air Force of helicopters in the 1950s, when it was all flown by Army individuals. Now, this is the subject of my PhD, why the Canadian Army was unsuccessful at implementing the innovation that was the helicopter and their own organic Air Force. And I take quite a bit of delight in the next slide, because when I was asked, after I finished the formal academic courses for the PhD back in 2007, I was asked to put a thesis proposal together. And one of the last professors before we were assigned advisors made it our homework to convey our thesis in the form of a haiku. Now, I think everyone understands a haiku is Japanese poetry of a specific number of syllables, 5, 7, and 5. And somehow the poem must touch on nature, an element or aspect of nature. So there were 11 in my PhD course, and I ended up being the only one that actually did the homework. And the following week, I was asked to share my haiku, and I'd like to do that right now, and then hopefully get a chance to explain what the elements of the haiku are, so that you can see how I leverage this particular exercise that I thought was quite fun and very well advised by the professor in question, and it helped me frame what it is I wanted to talk about. So here goes. 17 syllables and 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5, traditionally evoking images of the natural world or nature. So the helicopters flitting about below is a reference to their altitude. And the helicopters that I showed you, we tended to operate quite often getting grass stains on the skids. We were so low, up to about 80 miles an hour, within inches of the ground, all for keeping out of view of the bad guys. Behind trees, below hills, you name it. We were down there always. This particular poem refers to the altitude at which all of the helicopters are operating. Far below cold, soaring eyes, which speaks to the Cold War. And of course, cold is an element of nature. But it refers to, during the Cold War, the eyes belong to the Air Force leadership, who were watching things very, very closely from a very, very high altitude. And when you study military history and you look at the competition between services, the rivalry between services, you get a sense that a lot of air forces through the 50s and 60s tended to employ fighter pilots as their top leaders. And this was a byproduct of the way the Second World War unfolded. It was the fighter pilot who dominated. And for many years, 20 to 30 years after the war, fighter pilots tended to fall into the command of Air Force position time and again. And this element basically provided the stop raters that put an end, in Canada at least, to the Canadian Army's efforts to form their own Air Force. From high altitude, the winds of change gathered all the drifting birds. In Canada, through the 1960s, an effort at unification and integration of the different elements of the military into one formation called the Canadian Armed Forces essentially took all of the aircraft that used to belong to the Air Force and assigned them to these separate groups, the Army and the Navy. The commanders of the Air Force had enough by the time the early 1970s came along, and they reestablished an Air Force called Air Command, and they grabbed a hold of all of these drifting birds or airplanes, genres, types, and reassigned them to the Air Force itself. Returning to the tactics of innovation, let's talk about credibility, how to deal with stop raters. And you see reference here to a champion. It's the champion that is the pathway to credibility that you're seeking. The idea is you're seeking an ambassador, someone who has the charisma and the other cognitive knowledge-based skills to be able to convey the story that you want to convey, the narrative that you need to convey to make your innovation succeed. In the United States, the man in the middle on the cover of a cavalryman's story is General Hamilton Howe's. And Bergerson talks about Howe's. It's important that I identify him as the chairman of the Howe's board, which was a board formed by President Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who, when faced with the decision in the early 1960s whether to continue along a nuclear weapons deployment warpath, decided no, they didn't want to. They wanted an alternative solution to military capabilities, and they saw the helicopter as one of those alternatives. And they asked General Hamilton Howe's to come up with a way of selling the idea that helicopters would be a better alternative than nuclear weapons to demonstrate the power of the United States when there was a requirement to do so. The other man on the right, the two men, there's the same man, Murray MacDonald, was a Canadian Army aviator who was on General Howe's team when he was a liaison officer. And I just include him to show, again, that the story about Army innovation and the employment of the helicopter in support of the land forces was one that was undertaken by the UK, the US, and Canada all at the same time. And people from each of the different organizations were working together, and they would come back and share their experiences. And one of these experiences, of course, is the requirement for a champion to help sell the importance of helicopters. And that speaks to Bright's tactic of innovation known as credibility. Other champions in Canada included these two. General Jean-Victor Allard was the chief of the defense staff in 1968. You can see him in the three pictures. The first two pictures from left to right, he's wearing Army wings. But in the final picture in the middle, he's wearing pilot Canadian Air Force wings, which is quite remarkable because the course, the training syllabus one takes for each different program is remarkably different. It was a very, very short, abbreviated course that provided him with the Army wings. Why? Well, because the Army needed champions. And the sooner they got charismatic, knowledgeable folks like General Allard at the highest levels of the organization, the sooner they had a spokesperson who could champion the requirements for Army helicopters in support of the land forces. General Allard kept the wings on and, in fact, wore the Canadian pilot's wings to demonstrate that he was one of these champions. The man on the right at the microphone is General Dextraz, who was chief of the defense staff about 6 or 7 years later. And you'll notice he does not have any wings. The man behind him does, and that's Lieutenant General Bill Carr. And you may recall in 1968, I mentioned that the government of Canada had unified and integrated the Canadian separate services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, into one service, the Canadian Armed Forces. That effectively dissolved the Royal Canadian Air Force. It was wiped out, and all of the aircraft were divided up amongst the services. Well, General Carr, the man in the back of the picture on the right, effectively championed the creation of an Air Force again in 1975. And it was called Air Command. And he worked closely with General Dextraz and the Minister of National Defense, James Richardson, to stand up that Air Force. Imagine that innovation in its day, how difficult that was. Now, imagine how difficult that was convincing the new chief of the defense staff, who does not have wings on his chest, who would not be expected to serve as a champion or add credibility to the innovative effort to reintroduce an Air Force to a country that got rid of its Air Force 7 years earlier. Well, that was General Dextraz. And what's even more remarkable about General Dextraz is back in 1962, a few years before General Allard had undergone training, he too tried to learn how to fly, and he failed repeatedly, and he was ceased training. And it's quite interesting to ponder the possibility he may have been bitter about not having succeeded at the training, but thankfully the decision was made to remove him from training because the instructor pilots recognized he would likely be harmful to himself or to others because he just could not acquire the judgment that is necessary to operate aircraft in 3 dimensions without harming anybody. Compatibility is an important element, and I show a couple of photographs here to show how efforts were made to make this new helicopter, if you will, compatible. The bottom aircraft is one the artillery used in Canada for many years during and after the Second World War. And the top helicopter is one that was used to replace what the bottom aircraft does. It's interesting for me conveying the trajectory of this effort to innovate with both a helicopter and an organic air force, that all the elements of the Army agreed with this particular innovation, except for the artillery. And that was a real struggle to understand. But I finally did come to terms with it. The artillery kept using the fixed wing airplane at the bottom all the way to 1972, when the top helicopter was introduced. While the logistics element, the infantry element, the armored corps element, all the other elements of the Army had been using the helicopter since 1955. The artillery were the stoperators, if you will, the holdouts. And the only reason would seem to be when they did artillery work on the battlefield, they could reach altitudes with their airplane at the bottom that provided them or empowered them with the ability to engage targets of division size. In other words, 15,000 troops or dozens, scores of tanks, if you will. But the helicopter didn't operate at those same altitudes. It operated at treetop height, and you can't see very far at treetop height. And so the targets that you engage will be much smaller than divisions. So it's safe to say the stoperators in the artillery were stoperators simply because of the egotistical element that provided them with bigger targets to go after, as opposed to the more fluid battlefields that were the reality in the 1970s with a concept known as air-land battle. Here's another reason why the artillery were stoperators. I had the honor of speaking with Colonel James Braden, who was the author of From Hot Air to Hellfire. And on the cover of his book, you can see that fourth genre or type of helicopter I mentioned earlier, the armed or attack helicopter. And this particular one is known as the AH-64. And it is relevant to this discussion because of what Canada and Germany and the United States got involved in 1972, something called the Ansbach trials. The Ansbach was a place in Germany where these three countries got together and evaluated the capability and effectiveness of the armed helicopter. The United States was struggling with the decision whether to buy the Cheyenne armed helicopter, which was very expensive, and employed these pop-up and attack flight trajectories like the Cobra helicopter they were using in Vietnam at the time, as opposed to popping up just above the trees and engaging a target and then hiding behind the trees again. The Cheyenne would pop up and dive in on targets. And the United States wasn't happy. So they put together the Ansbach trials. Unfortunately, the people from the United States Army they assigned responsibility for the trials were returning home from their 1-year tour in Vietnam. So they were not motivated in the least to do that work. And they were a disciplinary handful as they transitioned through Germany on their way back home. The Germans had no experience with this kind of system, so the Canadians were asked to organize and execute the trials. And another Canadian Army pilot named Bruce Mulliner accepted the job, and he did a remarkable job, a very successful job that proved helicopters that used pop-up tactics, armed helicopters, could eliminate 42 enemy targets to the loss of one helicopter. It was incredible. Nothing like it had been seen before. But it also revealed the low flying tactics called nap of the earth tactics that the Canadians used and nobody else used were key. And Colonel Braden was able to jump in the back of one of the Kiowa helicopters. Kiowa is the one on the top. He was able to jump in the back as they ran one of the trials. And he was flabbergasted, shocked at the Canadian Army helicopter pilots' low-level flying tactics. Colonel Braden went back to the United States and explained all of this, and it was fundamental to the United States Army's decision to purchase the Apache helicopter seen here on the cover of the book instead of the Cheyenne helicopter. The Cheyenne was abandoned, the Apache was bought, and it began deployment in the mid-1970s, and it's still used today. The other thing that Colonel Braden explained to me was the title that they used for this particular helicopter, the Aerial Artillery Fire Support System. Now remember, we're talking about innovation and stop raiders and how people can get in the way of decisions or efforts to innovate. When the artillery saw the name of this helicopter, they were threatened, and they demanded control of aviation, especially armed attack aviation, only because it has this name artillery in it. Colonel Braden told a funny story when the artillery made this posturing. He set up a meeting and invited the artillery to come to the Training and Doctrine Command headquarters to discuss the decision of the Armored Corps to take control of the artillery's self-propelled howitzers or guns. Why? Because the self-propelled guns were on tracks like tanks. That obviously meant the Armored Corps, who controlled tanks, should get ownership of the artillery's guns. Well, the artillery was incensed at this idea, but it was precisely the insurgent bureaucratic politics that Bergerson was talking about, because Braden successfully deflected the artillery from their quest to take over the aviation, and everybody went back to their playpens, and the artillery forgot about their concerns. So another fascinating element of the effort to innovate, brought to you by the Armored Corps and the artillery, in the United States military forces. Canada's connection to all of this, of course, is Bruce Mulliner, an Army officer and aviator who led the Ansbach trials, which contributed significantly to the U.S. Army's decision to go with the Apache helicopter. So this is all related to the idea of homeostasis. In other words, you don't want to rock the boat. Stop raters are there. They're everywhere. And when you take on the idea of an innovation, you're more than likely to look at the incremental approach as opposed to the radical approach. A radical approach is going to rock the boat. The incremental one will allow you to stay closer to the equilibrium that everybody seems to be happy with right now, while making those subtle changes, sometimes not so subtle, but mostly subtle changes that folks will be able to, I guess, accept. And the 10 tactics of innovation provide you with the methodologies to pursue that incrementalism. So at this point, I'm ready to return to the idea of the job that I have as executive director, that entrustment without the endowment, the entrustment without the endorsement. And it was at the core of a journal article that I wrote for the Journal of Nonprofit Leadership, and titled Stakeholder Privileging and Ethical Dilemmas, the Conflicts and Consequences of Component Interests. And of course, the term component here refers to the wings or branches or chapters that I described earlier, the structure of the organization that turns out to be very, very important. I'll try to remember the name of the academic who brought this idea to discussions of strategy and strategic management, that strategy follows structure, or vice versa. The structure follows strategy. I always tend to remember that alphabetically. The A in strategy comes before the U in structure. You develop your strategy first, and then you change the structure to make it work. In the nonprofit sector, unethical behavior remains a persistent problem, and ethical challenges emerge in many forms. This is especially true where volunteers are concerned, and especially true in the kinds of organizations that are not professional associations or trade associations. There are other organizations like the one that I work for, which is a common or single interest, common or simple interest organization. The root cause of the unethical behavior is conflicts of interest. Structurally, I've discovered that leaders at the regional level tend to support folks in their region, as if to say the folks in their region are distinct or different from the folks in the organization, which is not true. So in this sense, I'm saying not all conflicts of interest are illegal. We tend to think of financial issues when we think of conflicts of interest, but there are many other conflicts of interest, some governance related, that are very important to look at. This brought me to the idea that we should probably audit for ethics and governance as opposed to just auditing for financials. And it's good to see that most organizations, professional societies anyway, establish norms of professional behavior. And we learned as prospective researchers in this particular DBA program through Module 5, the reflexive module, about the professional standards or societies that envelop the researcher sphere or domain. Very important ideas there that convey how to go about research and why it's important to get it right and thorough and disciplined. One of the things that you risk losing is legitimacy and reputation when you fail at applying a code of ethics. The reputation, of course, is the collective perception of stakeholders. I come back to this subject of stakeholders because I'm going to touch on it in a minute here to show that there is a connection to the folks outside your organization, many of whom have a vested interest in what you do, since they will be impacted by it, or that you have a vested interest in what they do because what they do has an impact on your organization. The disputes and dissonance we see in this organization are normally over prioritization of regional and local funding support versus support for other programs, products, and services. Again, we were created to focus on the individual, and structurally we organized around chapters or branches. But again, the chapters or branches are supposed to be collections of individual members. When the chapters and branches in the organization pursued introduction of a new membership category of people who actually did not become members, but they were only members of the chapter, that's when we introduced significant governance problems that continue to this day. And that is a process that took place almost 50 years ago. This maligned application of representation is a key issue for leaders. And I believe I have a slide here that speaks to representation and how it is a challenge for the particular organization I worked with. In the article, I touched on some cultural elements and, of course, philosophical ones: social constructivism, pragmatism, moralism. Moralism is one of those ideas that applies to government organizations, like the military one I worked in. Government organizations, especially militaries and police forces and prisons, they thrive on an element of coercion. But there's no place for coercion in nonprofit, volunteer-based organizations, at least the same kind of coercion that's necessary in the military. That's an important idea to understand. If you find yourself transitioning between a government and a nonprofit organization, or a private business-like organization and a nonprofit, there's a change in the depth of and breadth of coercion that you need to come to terms with. It will be important for your leadership perspective. Of course, this slide speaks to sub or micro cultures as well. And the introduction of what are called associate members, those who are not members of the organization, but are members of the chapters. These associate members come with their own microculture. They were brought in under two conditions. They didn't have to pay, but the two conditions were they were not allowed to run for office above leadership at the chapter or branch level. And when votes were tallied, the chapter or branch leaders were not allowed to count all of the associates' votes. They could only count 49% of the proportion of regular member votes that were tallied. This, of course, created schism and dissonance that we continue to live with to this very day. And of course, it's all based on the hierarchy, the traditional hierarchies that came to the fore in the middle of the 20th century. And the hierarchy has been discredited for decades now. Other forms of organization are proving to be more effective. And hierarchies are a form of command and control. Again, in nonprofit organizations, there's no place for that kind of coercion. Hierarchies also come with an organization chart that has nice lines and boxes, but the lines and the boxes only identify leaders in the organization. All the members in your organization are in the white space, invisible, undefined, almost not there. I spoke to this idea, representation and leadership. It turns out that the governors, the leaders, the directors who were elected at the regional level mistakenly believed it was their job to represent members in their regions at the board of directors table. But that's completely backwards. In nonprofit organizations, leaders like that are actually there to represent the association or organization to the members in their region. I've had a real struggle for years, the better part of 10 years, trying to explain this to leaders, that you don't have constituents. You are not elected by constituents. The Constitution and the bylaws say you must be elected by all the members everywhere. The individual in your hometown who happens to be your cousin is as important to your election as a man in St. John's, Newfoundland, 3,000 miles away, who also happens to be a member. Everybody gets to elect all their leaders. You are not elected just by the people in your hometown or your chapter or your region. That concept of representation that they adopted was completely backwards to what the Constitution actually tells them. And I put this clock, this leadership clock, together to help them understand the ideas behind this idea of representation. That they don't have constituents, and it's their job to represent the association to the people, not represent the people at the table. So we've talked about the structure of the organization. We're talking about beyond the financial when we address conflicts of interest that touch on code of ethics, again, beyond the financial. And finally, the nexus of organizational culture, structure, development, innovation, leadership, and change management is strategy. I have about 10 minutes left, and there are 10 slides. Strategy, defined by Richard Rumelt, touches on three things: a diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent actions. I emphasize at this slide the word action, and the thesis that I'm developing for my advisor and academic leaders in the UniAthena process speaks to this importance of action. In a nonprofit volunteer organization, you'll often be challenged by inaction, or at best reactive decisions, as opposed to passive and reactive decisions, as opposed to proactive decisions. And where there is inaction, you aren't likely to see any effort to diagnose what the problem is, nor are you likely to see an effort made to provide a guiding policy that will help move the organization forward. I really like Richard Rumelt's definition of strategy, one of the best that I've seen. Strategy, like leadership, is a very complex subject. There's so much to it. Yes, what are we to make of a complete lack of action? One of the methods by which action takes shape in organizations is resolutions. At least I believe resolutions are important. And over the last few weeks, I've been putting together my thesis proposal that seeks to analyze the process of resolutions, starting from the very beginning in 1948 all the way through to the end. And I find that the dynamics of resolutions evolved over time to change in favor of one particular group as opposed to the other. And the poster that you see on the wall behind me is the same one that you see on the screen here now. And I'll just point out that in the middle are these cartoons. The one speaks to the manifest function of the organization, which is advocacy, advocating for the country's Air Force and the men and women in uniform. The other cartoons, youth, commemoration, heritage, camaraderie, social support, and democracy are what's referred to as latent functions, the things that develop over time as a consequence of the activities that are undertaken. So advocacy is the main function, and all the others are latent functions. This also speaks to the idea that all organizations have an instrumental aspect and a expressive aspect. Some of you may be familiar with Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French philosopher who traveled to the United States and Canada in 1829, 1830, and he wrote the book Democracy in America. And he was the first one to come along and say, you know what happens when people consider the decision to join an organization? He analyzed the nonprofit sector in the United States at the time, and he was quite astonished by the success of the social environment in the US in the years after the French Revolution, if you can imagine. And he determined that people ask two questions without exception. They ask, what's in it for me? And they also ask, what's in it for the good of the order? Now, the question, what's in it for me, is understandable. You're looking for the benefits that will accrue to you as a consequence of joining this particular organization. The other question you ask, what's in it for the good of the order, is you're looking for the benefits that will accrue to the organization or the domain or the sphere as a consequence of the fact that you join, others join, and assets, resources are applied to the activities meant to be of benefit to the good of the order. Those two questions align perfectly with this instrumental and expressive idea. Instrumental functions are those that are of benefit to non-members, people outside. You don't have to be a member to benefit from what the organization does owing to its instrumental functions. Expressive functions are those that are undertaken for the benefit strictly of the members, you. This also aligns very well with what a philosopher and social scientist named Jeremy Purnell said. He said, all organizations are the same. There are two types of people: those who work toward the mission of the organization and those who work for the organization itself. So one aligned for the purpose of the organization, the other aligned to the organization. Perfect alignment with the instrumental and the expressive. Perfect alignment with the folks who are individually concerned about the benefits to them and others who are interested in the benefits to the non-members, the government, if you will, for example. So I attempted with this chart to explain to the leaders the status of the organization. The ring immediately outside of the cartoons in the middle is the ring of stakeholders. And you can see there are very many stakeholders here. I won't list them, but they're all there. And I've put them there to show that when the directors consider what it is they do, there's a great deal to think about. Outside that is a ring of verbs: inculcate, motivate, illuminate, donate, narrate, and so on. Verbs are what? Verbs are actions. You remember my emphasis on actions before. And finally, the last ring are the values. This is something that Bain and Company came up with, and I discovered or I learned about these value badges from a Scottish presenter who managed golf courses, but he made a presentation to the Association of Association Executives in Gothenburg, Sweden in 2019, which I attended. And it was great to see these value badges because it really brought home to me this idea of values. That's a very difficult concept. When you ask yourself what your values are, it's not easy. Well, here you have a perfect example. Some of them are motivates, it evokes pride, it's fun and entertaining, it rewards me, it validates me, it opens doors for me, it reduces costs, it avoids risks, and so on and so on. When you're able to put these images and words and pictures and graphics in front of your directors and leaders, it presumably helps them understand a great deal what it is you do. Youth. Our job is to help the air cadets in Canada. Advocacy. Here you have an idea presenting a paper to government leaders about the benefits of a certain new airplane. Commemoration. Teaching Canadians all about the accomplishments of the men and women in Air Force uniform. Heritage. Here you have someone who is asking questions about their ancestor and what they did in the Air Force. And of course, democracy. Many organizations, especially nonprofits, are in the business of conveying the principles of democracy everywhere. So important today. Camaraderie and social spirit. Social isolation is a serious problem everywhere today, especially here in North America. And the more you can do to bring socially isolated people together, the better they do. They thrive. And here are the elements of value that I spoke to earlier, Bain and Company. I believe that concludes the presentation. I am prepared for questions.
Thank you very much, Dean. In fact, I love the flow of the presentation where you started with the family and flowed on to the career, and people are thrilled with the helicopter images. In fact, when I received the slides, I was like, really, why is there helicopter images? But it really is a hit with the audience, and we've been flooded with questions.
Oh, okay.
I will try to, put them together, most commonly asked questions, so that we don't bore the audience. I'm sure the audience has had uh, an overload and they have been overwhelmed reactions. They've been enjoying the webinar so far. So first question, questions vary from like your career. It varies from military to culture to NGOs, everything. There are all sorts of questions. So firstly, the question is, does culture influence behavior?
Well, yes, indeed, an excellent question. But behavior is culture, right? Um, what happens? Edgar Schein, Schein, has explained organizational culture the best in his book, Organizational Culture and Leadership. And one of the things that he said that really resonates with me is this: leaders create the organization's culture when they create the organization. And then it's the organization's culture that decides who gets to lead the organization going forward. It's a powerful force, and leaders need to understand and confront that force in order to shape it for the benefit of the organization. Culture is the set of beliefs, values, behaviors, and attitudes, frames of reference. They come together, and people behave in certain ways because what they've done tends to work. It's informal and unofficial, but because it works, as they go through the processes of internal integration and external adaptation, those behaviors take root, and it really becomes a challenge for leaders to change them.
Our next question is, why do people resist change?
People resist change because it takes them out of their comfort position. Imagine, if you will, you get really good at doing something because you've done well at school, you've been enthralled with a specific topic, and you get employed leveraging that topic and knowledge. So you're really good at it. But of course, with the passage of time, we learn more, and someone comes along and changes it up. All of a sudden, the very thing that may have given you identity is no longer important. And you feel disenfranchised and uncomfortable and upset. It's no wonder folks in that position resist.
I think that's well answered. In fact, Somebody says behavior is culture, leaders create organizational culture is a very nice statement. Indeed, it is. I think it sums up what culture is. So, another question is, do non-profit organizations need good leaders or good managers?
In my case, they're probably good managers as opposed to leaders. And that's because the the organization was created to draw in retired Air Force people. And when that happens, like I just described, you come to the table with a set of skills and knowledge that you've derived or obtained in your career, but you find yourself in a different world, one that does not necessarily thrive on the very knowledge and skills that you're bringing to the table. So they fall back to what they know and only focus on the military side, completely forgetting or deciding not to pursue learning what it will take to make a nonprofit organization thrive. It's a real challenge. I remember this coming to me when I was asked to be an instructor pilot after finishing my first tour flying observation helicopters. And I'd asked myself, why me? Whatever gave you the idea I know how to teach someone to fly? I don't. Nobody's taken the time to teach me to be a teacher. Why are you asking me to be a teacher now? And that for me was a perfect example of what I'm now faced with in a non-military organization led typically by military people who haven't got any idea about the nonprofit sector.
That's well answered. So, how does it feel, flying for so many hours? Your profile says 3,500 hours of flying time. How did you achieve all that 3,500 of flying hours?
1 hour at a time, I guess. Yeah, it started in 1982, and the first tour ended 5 years later, and then a 3-year tour instructing, and then another 3-year tour flying different helicopters with a UN tour in the middle of it, 1995. And then 2 more flying tours after that, each of 2 years duration. But at the last 2 tours were, I was deputy commanding officer in one, which was a really hard job, and then commanding officer job, which was also hard, but not as hard as a deputy because you get a little bit more time. But I found I was just going from flight test to flight test with nothing in between. So I lost the interest in flying as a general thing to do because I was always preparing for an evaluation more often than not when I was commanding. The hours add up, and there were lots of deployments, 3 or 4 deployments to Norway, deployments all through the United States and the Caribbean and Europe. You average about between 300 and 400 hours a year.
That's wonderful. So, what is the most hardest thing that you've done so far across this wide range of career?
The hardest thing that I've done so far, it has to be this DBA. It's so rewarding, but I think one of the things I emphasize today that when you talk about leadership or strategy or organizational culture, researchers or academics understandably focus on one element of it or a very, very small number of elements because it's important to understand the dynamics, if you will, or the connections or the relations. But in a non-academic sense, people like me, practitioners, are aware there's a whole lot more going on. And while it is true what the academics will tell you, because they are very, very smart about the levers. If you pull this one lever, this might happen, or that lever. There's a whole bunch more stuff that's going on. So being able to put all that together into a document or a lesson that conveys an important point is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do.
It's wonderful. Since you mentioned DBA, Dr. Sri sends her love and her regard for you, and that we are in fact grateful and mesmerized by your presentation. She's not here, but yeah, she does send her love and her regards to you.
Thank you so much. I am really enjoying this particular part of my journey. There's some remarkable people, and they've been very understanding and helpful, and I'm looking forward to more.
For the audience, Dr. Sri is our DBA research head, and Dean is one of our learners here. Okay, moving on to our next question is, what is the best change management models, or how to bring about change management? What is the best way?
Cotter, Cotter. His 8-step method is by far the best. The Procy model is good. The Kurt Lewin had a very easy model. Freeze everything, make the little changes that you need, and then unfreeze everything. That's an easy way of looking at it. But Cotter, Kotter, is an 8-step method that everybody needs to be familiar with.
What is the most important thing in leadership?
Leadership? I'm so glad you asked that question. I took a book off of my library today that I wanted to share with everybody because I think all of us are the same. We struggle so much with the idea of leadership. And there's so many good books, Norrie and Yang and Northcott, I think. Anyway, lots of great researchers and folks, experts on leadership. But I've considered them all, and I've come to the conclusion it's a little bit easier when you think about the reality. There's only two kinds of leadership. No matter what you're looking at, there's only two: transactional and transformational. Everything else that you might want to talk about falls into one of those two categories. Charismatic leaders, servant leaders, exchange theory, emotional intelligence, on and on and on, authoritarian, participative. All of those are just different methods or personality attributes or approaches. At the end of the day, it's either there's a transaction involved or it's transformational. Remember the two questions that I shared with everybody that are accredited to Alexis de Tocqueville from 1830-31 in his book, Democracy in America. What's in it for me? Transactional. What's in it for the good of the order? Transformational. There's only two kinds of leadership. If ever you want a book that explains leadership in a very remarkable way, it's this Irving Goffman, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And I will just read a quick sentence here. He uses the metaphor of theatrical performance as a framework. The metaphor of theatrical performance as a framework. Each person in everyday social intercourse presents himself or herself and his or her activity to others, attempts to guide and control the impressions they form of him or her, and employs certain techniques in order to sustain his or her performance, just as an actor presents a character to an audience. I think in this world of social media and television and the like, we can all appreciate this metaphor of theatrical performance. And it really hits it home to me. As a leader, you are on stage every moment of every day. And guess what? Your audience changes up in a heartbeat with every second, every blow of the wind. Your audience is new. And you need to adjust your performance, your approach, your methods to every different person that comes to you. That's leadership. And some folks are really good at it, and the rest of us are learning.
Can we have the name and title of the book and the author again? so that if our audience want to write it down or note it down somewhere?
Yes, of course. The name of the author is Irving Goffman, and Irving is Erving, and Goffman is Goffman. And the
Fantastic.
title is The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. A remarkable book, relatively short, but this more than anything captures the idea of leadership. And remember, leadership is either transactional or it's transformation.
So now, should a leader be his success should be measured by, what is the yardstick? Is it by achieving the goal, or what should be the yardstick for a leader?
Leadership is about convincing someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. So, what it is they try to convince that other person to do would be the goal. And measurement of the leader's effectiveness would be achievement of the goal, yes, but it would also probably be measured in terms of the follower's willingness to do it again or say yes again. Um, there is a certain amount of social capital that is exchanged when, say, a transformational leader convinces somebody to do something for the benefit of the organization, right? And that social capital goes into the little bank account in the follower's pocket and the leader's pocket. And that's going to be a measure of the leader's success as well. Is there any social capital exchange? And are both individuals, leaders and followers, letting that capital build up?
I think that's a beautiful way of putting what leadership is.
Mhm.
Convince somebody to do what they would ideally not do is a very beautiful way. So now
Yeah.
we have people asking about other types of leadership, like how can we change autocrat leaders to become democrat, and uh, so around it. Yeah.
How can we
Change
change all the
autocrat
lead
leaders to democrat leaders.
to become democratic leaders? Yeah. Um, I guess it would be important to understand what's meant by the term democratic leaders. And for me, it means a leader that's aware of what the majority of folks desire. Um, that takes a great deal of work. She has to um, sense the group, understand where most of them want to go, and help them come to terms with the best path to follow. Democracy, I think, is a scale of participation, and it means you're going to do what the majority wants without losing the minority at the same time. Uh, in order to, I think the answer brings us back to the idea of transformational leadership. You're going to convince people to do something that is going to mean something really, really important to the organization they belong to, not necessarily to them as individuals, but to the organization.
I think that is what leadership is about, making them work towards the organization, in turn, building themselves in the process, right?
Yes, yes. Mm.
That brings us to the next question, where it's again about culture. How can we ensure we assimilate multicultural societies with good leadership?
It's, I think, the aspect of multiculturalism is uh, is not a detractor from good leadership. Um, as you grow and evolve in your own culture, you come, if you're paying attention, you come to appreciate what works and what doesn't work among your people, those who share your own worldview and the like. Um, I think that that question is really, really good because I think it's asking, okay, what happens when you break out of your culture into a different one. What makes a leader stand out? And I think it's adaptability, right? They adapt to the new culture. They understand the mechanisms of culture. They figure out what's important and what's not. And just like Irving Goffman describes, you recognize that you're performing, you're on stage, and your audience has changed. And one of the first things that you do as as an actor or actress, if you will, is understand your audience. I explained at the beginning of this presentation I was at a bit of a disadvantage because I didn't actually know who might be in my audience. Was I speaking to students? Was I speaking to professional academics? A mix? Or were there others involved, like government officials? I don't know. I can't see them, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a mixed audience.
Hmm.
Next is how can leaders inspire and motivate others, their employees, followers?
Oh, wow, that's a transformational leader question for sure. The inspiration is related to the vision step. Um, and I remember when I was invited, I was encouraged to talk to the differences between organizations, government, private, and the nonprofit. And for a moment there, I remembered that government organizations thrive on regulations, private organizations thrive on vision because vision is all about money, and nonprofit organizations thrive on mission. And so I think the question was uh,
How can leaders inspire and motivate?
inspiration, right? And I indicated that the element that speaks to inspiration is the vision part. You want to explain to the employees what you aspire to. What are you trying to become? And if you do it right, it turns out to be something that you can't actually ever become because it's so lofty and so out of reach. But you manage to inspire everybody when you convince them that's the right direction to go. This is what we need to do and why. The other aspect about inspiration comes from storytelling or a narrative. If you have the ability to craft a story and you can share that story in a meaningful way, you will inspire folks to follow you. So when it comes time to assign new duties or head towards a new goal, take a moment to craft a story that pulls from behind uh, uh, some of the elements of the past that were successful, pulls from today, the core competencies that you want to talk about, in fact, highlighting some of the key people in the organization that are really pulling their weight, and then pulls from the future that sort of helps them understand if they do these kinds of things, they're going to shape an organization that will look like this in a year or 3 years' time. That story, that narrative will be a really cool way of inspiring everybody.
I couldn't agree more. Storytelling is I think one of the most beautiful and most the best way of convincing another person, from a baby, not a baby, maybe a toddler, to an old man. I think stories and narratives are the best way to inspire. Uh, you know, I've seen my MBA students, DBA learners, my children, my niece, my nephew. I mean, there is nothing more powerful than a story. It's I think it gets to their heart very, very easily. Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, the next question is on NGOs, and what are the skills and experiences that are required to work in an NGO or to run an NGO?
Um, yeah, so a non-government organization or a non-profit organization, um, ex- uh, one of the skills, one of the most important skills is understanding the volunteer. sector or volunteerism. And I touched on one of the elements of the volunteer sector that is not as obvious as one might think, and that was coercion. I tried to stress that there's no place for coercion in the volunteer sector in the same way that we would expect to see and in fact thrive on coercion like we do in the government. Governments thrive on regulations. Regulations are a form of coercion, an understandable and necessary form of coercion. And some government organization like police forces, military forces, coercion is absolutely essential. In nonprofits, not so much, especially when you're dealing with volunteers. So NGO leaders need to understand the volunteer sector and volunteerism, the phenomenon of volunteerism.
That brings us to our last question. What is the best type of leadership according to you?
The best kind of leadership?
Yes.
I'm a fan of transformational leaders. I'm not a fan of transactional leaders. Transactional leaders approach their role with a very narrow mind in terms of the temporal aspect of the task at hand. And of course, transactional leaders, for those folks who are familiar with McGregor and Theory X and Theory Y, will understand that transactional leaders espouse the Theory X, which is suspicious of people and human nature. Or in terms of leadership, they're more task-oriented, not people-oriented. Well, as opposed to Theory Y, they're people-oriented, they value people, they love people, they inspire people, and that's the transformational leader. I think leaders who are capable of transformational leadership have a lot more to draw on: skills, social capital, ideas, aspirations than the transaction.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions. I think I've covered most of what were asked, and that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much for being so patient and answering all the questions and giving us such a detailed presentation of everything. I think squeezing in so much of information in like 90 minutes must have been quite a task for you. So thank you very much. And thank you. Thanks to the audience for being such good audience. And we've had most of them stay back till the end. That really speaks. We always have people leaving in between if they don't find it interesting. But then we have most of them staying back till the end of the webinar. Thank you so much. I'm sure this is all because of your presentation. And I think the way you presented and all that you had to offer to the audience. Thank you so much, audience. You can check our website, UniAthena, for any more information on courses. We also have this a webinar live on our YouTube channel. You can go back and check for the recording. If you want to revisit the webinar and want to learn something out of it, or you want to share it with your friends, you can please go ahead and share. The webinar certificates will be given to you, will be sent to your email ID. Please give us about 3 weeks of time. Only if you attended till the end of the webinar, you'll be giving it. You'll be getting your certificates. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you all again in the next webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much.
I'll just put my email
Sure.
in the chat for everybody, director@airforce.ca, and my phone number 613-612-7223 is for WhatsApp. And I'm sorry if we didn't get around to your questions, but I will look forward to seeing your questions if you want to email me at director@airforce.ca or WhatsApp 613-612-7223. It was an honor and a pleasure. I really like doing this. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dean. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your email ID and WhatsApp number. We did have quite a few queries, but I wasn't sure if you were comfortable sharing. This is really good. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.